We began today by talking about where we've been. This is the Torah, first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch. We began with Genesis, where we have the myth creation stories of our tradition. We have the garden, we have the fall, we have the new life with the rainbow and Noah. We have the fall again. We have another fall with Babel. And God decides to work through a family, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph. We hear the stories of that community and God's faithfulness and their faithfulness, even in their fallenness, as they do things that are a little bit goofy and out of touch with both their neighbor and with God. Nonetheless, they persevere until they find themselves as slaves in Egypt. We get to the book of Exodus, where Moses leads the people out of slavery under the rule of Pharaoh and into the desert. God has sent Moses. Moses is far from perfect. I find it completely ironic that he is the giver of laws and is so hard on the people of Israel, particularly about things that call them out of relationship with God. And yet the dude was far from perfect, beginning with a murder of an Egyptian early in his life. Nonetheless, he becomes a giver of laws and goes up onto the mountain where he meets God and gets what we call the apoditic laws. And those are, that's spelled A-P-O-D-I-C-T-I-C laws. Those are the laws that are inflexible. They're completely rigid. There's no way to get around them. And they are the 10 Commandments to start with. And then in Exodus, we come across what are called the caustic laws. And those are the if-then laws. And you find those in Exodus chapter 21, 22, and 23. And finally, we move to the book of Leviticus, where we encounter the laws of holiness. It's important to remember that the book of Leviticus was a community of people writing laws to try to stay in relationship with God. They were writing laws that sought to keep their community together and everybody on the same page. And also they were writing laws that help the powerful stay in power. Laws are complicated and laws haven't changed. We still have laws that we write even to this day to keep people in relationship, to keep people safe, and also in some cases to keep people who have power in power. It's generally the powerful that write the laws. That was certainly the case in the book of Leviticus, written by the priests. But the goal was, and they looked at the world differently than we look at it. We talked a lot about the Jubilee year, where you gave property back to the people who originally had the property. That keeps a stasis with regards to ownership and power within a community. It also views property differently than we view property. At the end of the day, they believed fundamentally that it came from God. One of the questions that came up today during our time together was, why do they sacrifice so much to God? Why does God need that? There's probably a ton of answers to that, but the thing we ended up talking about had to do with they ate and were nourished by this food, and God loved the pleasing odor and was nourished by these sacrifices. And yet the sacrifices also changed. Some believe that the god Moloch was nourished by infants and people that were sacrificed. The Jews didn't believe that was the kind of God that they worshiped. But it was a God that loved the smell of a good barbecue, it turns out. We talked about the burnt offerings again, how that was the offering given day in and day out to stay in good relationship with God, and that those sacrifices weren't eaten. But today we also talked about sin offerings and how when a specific sin was done, even if it was unintentional, they would give an offering. And the sin offering was shared by the entire community, not the person that offered it, but by the entire community, which is sort of cool. People must have liked it when somebody sinned and had to then give a sacrifice. The kinds of communal sins are interesting because they're generally ones that broke relationship: infidelities, adulteries, murder, infant sacrifice, divorce, false worship. These are things that they believed broke relationship within the community and were needed to be atoned for. There were also the guilt offerings. There's sort of a step down. A guilt offering was given if you violated holy things, if you robbed, if you extorted somebody, you had to give a guilt offering. And finally, there were the peace offerings. And peace offerings are different. They were really thanksgiving offerings. It's the only offering in which cattle that was sacrificed was then eaten. Right? If you wanted beef, you had to give a peace offering or a thanksgiving offering. And then the whole community shared in that. Also, peace offerings, you couldn't give a tiny little bird. So it turns out most of these thanksgiving and peace offerings were given by people who had more. But the people who had less benefited from them. That's an interesting idea as well. Maybe one we should wonder about more in the patterns of our own lives. We talked a little bit about the clobber passages, and we talked about exegesis and eisegesis. Exegesis is getting to understand the context of the text, scripture at that particular time. Eisegesis is bringing our own perspectives into it, our own predispositions into it. And so when we read text, we're trying to understand who wrote it, why they wrote it, for the people for whom they wrote it. But also we come across things, at least if you're like me, that we call clobber verses. You're like, oh, what? Ouch. And when we come across the ouch verses, it is an opportunity to deeply consider why. Why does this move me or irritate me or hurt me? And then we're invited to reflect on that in our own prayer life and our own examine as we look at our day and our life, but also within the life of our community, right, with the brothers or sisters of our community. And not in a way that is trying to move somebody towards a particular way of seeing, but as a community that helps unfold the seeing for the one for whom the clobber verse hurt. What can happen too often in communities is I have a clobber verse that you don't see as a clobber verse, or you believe that is completely important. And if I bring it to you, you want to convince me. Church isn't about convincing. It is about hearing. It's about seeing. It is about sharing. It is about healing. It's about community. And clobber verses, ironically, give us an opportunity to build community and to unveil within our own hearts things that stir us. Jesus took on these clobber verses. One that we looked at today in Leviticus was about menstruating women, or a woman with uncontrolled menstruation, what that, how that isolated her from the community that prescribed to the Levitical laws. Jesus heals the woman with the bleeding. But it wasn't just to heal her, but it was to show inclusion, that God was with her then, and God is with her in her healing. That's true with you and I as well. So we wrapped up by thinking about the book of Numbers that we're going to encounter this coming week, and how it is themed on this idea that God keeps God's promises. So we returned with the people of Israel into the desert, the wandering for 38 years as they approach the promised land. And we explore that part of our tradition and the history of the Jewish people. Thank you for being with me today, and peace upon your souls.